we're almost done with the basics about Angular. We learned a lot about components, the basic building block of any Angular app, about how it starts the app, how we can communicate with our templates in our components so that we can output data or react to events. Now there is one other key building block you probably use in any Angular app you build: directives. What are directives? Directives are instructions in the DOM. And we actually already use directives without knowing it. Components are kind of such instructions in the DOM. Once we place the selector of our component somewhere in our templates, at this point of time, we're instructing Angular to add the content of our component template and the business logic in our TypeScript code in this place where we use the selector. This was our instruction. Angular, please add our component in this place. And indeed, components are directives, but directives with a template. There are also directives without a template. So an example would be the app turn green directive, which would be a custom directive we could build. We typically add directives with an attribute selector, but technically the selector of a directive can be configured just like the selector of a component. So you could also use CSS classes or the element style, but again, typically you use the attribute style. And on this paragraph, this directive might simply color the text green, you could say. So Angular would find this instruction. Here we would have defined our directive with the directive decorator to inform Angular that this class holds a directive. And there we might have the logic to turn this green. Now we will learn how to write our own directives in the section focused on directives in this course, but there are a couple of built-in directives which are really useful. Let's take a closer look at how we use them and what they do for us in the next lectures. In the example application we built thus far, we haven't used any directives besides components, which are directives, that's important. But we haven't used any other directives, no built-in directives. Now let's say one thing we want to do is, we only want to show this server was created text here. There's no need to have this no server was created text to be displayed. So it would be nice if we could conditionally show this message. And for that, we need some help. We can use a directive shipping with Angular, the ngIf directive. Now it works like an if statement, and to be precise, it works like this. In our service component here, where we output the server creation status, I will comment this out so that we can still reference this code, but now I will add a new paragraph where I simply say server was created, server name is bind my server name. Now with this in place it will still work, but now we always see with every keystroke how we change this server name, not really what I want. Instead I want to output it as soon as we click this button here. So what I can do is, I can add a directive here, and as I said, typically directives are added by using an attribute selector, and pretty much all the built-in directives use that selector, ngIf does. And then ngIf is added by adding a star, this is important, ngIf. The star is required because ngIf is a structural directive, which means it changes the structure of our DOM. It either adds this element or it doesn't add it. So that's just some extra information for Angular. The directive itself is just ngIf, but the star is required. Without it, it will not work correctly. So ngIf. And then we can set up our condition here between the quotation marks. For ngIf, this has to be any expression returning true or false, deciding whether this should be added or not. So here, it would make sense to add a new property, which we name server created and set it to false. And we set this to true once the button is clicked. So here in onCreateServer, which is triggered when the button is clicked, here we set server created equal to true, like that. Now with this, we can go back to our template and simply bind ngIf to server created. And again, this could also call a method which returns true or false, or directly perform the check between the quotation marks, anything which returns true or false. Now with this, if we save this, what you see is that there is no text, but if I name this test server 2 and click the button, now the text is added here. And the interesting thing is, if I reload the app and we inspect our DOM here, you see here that's our app server component. Below that is, above that is the button. But if I click this button, a new element was entered here, the paragraph. And here you see kind of the hook which Angular created to know where this should be entered. But the important thing is it's really added or removed to or from the DOM. It's not there all the time. It's not hidden. It's just not there, which is super important to understand. So that's ngIf. Again, the star at the beginning indicates that this is a structural directive really changing the DOM as you just saw. In the last lecture, we had a look at the basic ngIf syntax, and that's the syntax you're going to use most of the time. There is one alternative to it though. Sometimes you have not only the if condition, but also an else condition. So here we might want to say server was created, server name is something with ngIf, but we could also add an else block where we then want to say no server was created. Now we deleted that exact text for the reason that we don't want to see it. But imagine that we do want to show that alternative. So no server was created, could be the text here. And now we want to show this paragraph only if ngIf is not true, or this condition, server created, is not true. We can achieve this by placing a local reference on this element here. And local reference is something I will dive deeper into in the understanding components and data binding section of this course. For now, let's think of it as a marker. So I will name this no server, any name you like. Let's name this no server with a capital S. And now we need to change the paragraph here to ng template. That is a component, a directive shipping with Angular, which you can use to mark places in the DOM. And now I will add the paragraph back in this template with the text in between, like this. So now basically the text we want to output. And now with ng template, with the local reference, this marker on it, we mark a certain spot in the template which we want to show conditionally. Now to show it conditionally, we simply enhance ngIf by also adding else and then no server. So this marker we placed on ng template. And that's all the syntax we need. If we save this, you see no server was created, and as soon as I click here, that gets replaced with server was created. So that is ngIf else. A nice little addition in a use case where you have, well, an else condition. Of course, the alternative would always be to simply use ngIf with the reversed check, so with exclamation mark server created. But that here is another nice alternative. Now, I'm going to delete it. You will find an article after the section here though, where you can find this code again in case you're interested. And we will also use this code in the course project we're going to build. I just wanted to highlight that this option exists. Using ngIf like this, however, is the case you will see most often. Now let's continue. In the last lecture, we saw ngIf, super useful directive, and ngIf was a structural directive. The other type of directives are attribute directives, which are called like this because they really just look like normal HTML attributes without a star basically. Let's add one. On the server component here, we output the server status, right? And the server status always is offline. Let's mix this up. Let's say we want to dynamically create this. So I'll add the constructor, which is just a built-in method each TypeScript class has, which is called once this component is created. And here I will set the server status to a random value. I will use the math random function, and this gives us a random number between 0 and 1, a floating point number. And if this is greater than 0.5, I want to set the status to online Otherwise, I will set it to offline. So with that, we shouldn't get the same status all the time. And now, let's check this. We see indeed online and offline. That's lucky. Could have, of course, also been both offline since we have a 50% chance. Now we have two different statuses here. And now let's say we want to change the color of the background color of this component depending on the server status. For this, we can use another directive. On this wrapping paragraph here, I can add it, and it's called ng-style. Now that's a built-in directive. You can recognize this on the ng at the beginning. And ng-style, that's the directive, is pretty useless like this. We need to give it some configuration to do something. That is why we will use property binding on this directive. And it's super important to understand that these squared brackets here are not part of the directive name. The directive name is just ng-style. The squared brackets indicate that we want to bind to some property on this directive, and this property name happens to also be ng-style. We will see this in practice on our own directives in the directives section later. But super important to understand that property binding is not the same as a directive. It's totally different. We are binding to a property of the directive. This ng-style property expects to get a JavaScript object. And here we define key value pairs of the style name as the key and the value of the style as the value. So for example, we could bind background color, and if you want to use this notation with the dash, you have to wrap it in single quotation marks to make it a valid JavaScript property name. Or you use the camel case notation background color like this. And then you could set this to red. But I don't want to set it to red, I want to set it to something depending on the server status. So here we could simply call a method getColor. So that is really mixing now all the things and make it clear that between the quotation marks we are executing TypeScript code here. So therefore we can of course call a method. Now getColor is a method we can add here. And getColor should now, let's say, return green if the status is online and red otherwise. So I will return something. First I check the server status, so this server status, and if this is equal to online, using a ternary expression here, I will return green, otherwise I will return red. So getColor will return green or red, and this is then assigned as the background color with ng-style. If we now save this, let's have a look at the result. We see indeed the running server has a green background and the offline server has a red one. So that is working. ng-style allows us to dynamically update that. If I reload, you see now both are offline, so both are red now. And that is the big advantage of ng-style. It allows you to dynamically update the styles. And of course, if the server status here did change over time, it would update the styling respectively. So this binding we set up here still is working. If the server status here, which is responsible for choosing the right color, changes, it updates the style. So that's ng-style, an attribute directive added like an attribute, and in this case also using property binding to configure it.